count from 3.
Oh,
just go. Okay, you're on.
hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And I'm going to ask for your patience with all things right now as we go through this very difficult time together in our country and in the world. We are doing our best to make sure that the minimal services that the synagogue can offer, whether it's tefillot in the morning, we had morning minyan this morning, or Shabbat services will continue on until we can't do that anymore. I would say that all things happening in the synagogue for minyan, unless you are in the age that is a little safer at this time, you probably shouldn't come to minyan, nor should you come to Shabbat morning services or Friday evening services. Rather, you should take advantage of them online. I want to thank Dan and Mary Joan for all their work to make sure that the streaming video takes place, and also to Amy Karp, who has really worked so very hard to make this happen today. Going forward next week, we're going to do this class through Zoom video. The reason is that I'm not going to be able to have a back and forth with people. This is just me talking to you. Works for me. I'm not sure how well it's working for you. And Amy, so for today, Amy has sent out her cell phone. So you want to text her with questions or comments, we'll do that. Next week it'll be more interactive. However, when we go to Zoom video next week, we're also going to ask you to watch the videos in advance. Amy has sent you all the links to get into Hartman so that you can watch them. So I'm going to ask that you you can do a cursory reading of the materials in our books, and then to also watch the video so that we can get right into a conversation. Today, we're going to show the videos as part of our session as well. So once again, starting next week, we're going to be on Zoom video. It's very easy to link up, and Amy will send you all the information. And we will persevere. And again, thank you for your patience. Our topic today is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And to contextualize our conversation, we need to look at the world of anti-Semitism pre-67 and then post-67. There's a book that you should be looking at if you have interest in the Roosevelt administration and anti-Semitism. It's called The Jews Should Keep Quiet. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Stephen S. Weiss, and the Holocaust. It's written by Raphael Medoff, and it's an excellent book, and I would say it's also quite chilling. Because there you see the manner in which Stephen S. Weiss, who was the best known Jew in his time, a very prominent Reform rabbi, but also the leader of AJC, and so he was the recognized leader of the Jewish community, and how he attempted to meet with Roosevelt, to implore Roosevelt, and to be the go-between between the Roosevelt administration and the Jewish community. And what Medoff shows is the deep-set anti-Semitism that ran through the White House and was also expressed by President Roosevelt, and the impotence, really, of Stephen S. Weiss, and the manner in which he was manipulated during that time period. And one of the things that came to my mind as I was reading through the book was how the Jewish world changed with the state of Israel, how the Jewish self-understanding changed with the state of Israel. So we understand the history and the evolution of Israel not only as a reality, 1948, when Ben-Gurion establishes the state of Israel. Those are the most striking Jewish words, that he is inaugurating a Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years. The focus of the Jewish community between 45 and, let's say, 67 was on the resettlement of Jews and their survivors and the building of the state of Israel. Those were our people's projects during that time period. I'd also suggest to you that during that time period, we see that as the world comes to see the full extent of the Holocaust, that anti-Semitism needs to go underground. It needs to kind of go away. But beginning in 67, we see a revival of anti-Semitism, not in America, not in Europe. We see it in the former Soviet Union. And that's going to be a major focus of this conversation. The fact that the Soviet Union is supporting the Arab states and the United States is supporting Israel makes this conflict in 67 a crucible, if you will, for the entire conflict with the United States. And the fact that Russia has poured millions and millions of rubles into this effort, which was a remarkable failure, not only for the Arab states that lost the war in 6 days, but also it's a blow to Russia, and certainly a feather in Uncle Sam's cap. And so what we're seeing here, and I want to look in your books with you, I take it that you've taken the time to look at this, but I want to underscore a few pieces of information, because if you want to understand the UN Resolution 3379 in 1975, the famous Zionism is racism, if you want to understand that and you want to understand its underpinnings, you need to understand where it's coming from, who, aside from the Arab states that are pushing this, why is Russia the architect of this kind of pernicious legislation? And so beginning on page 191 in your books, if you look at this is in 1972. You're looking at a photograph of a float in a May Day parade. Zionism is the weapon of imperialism. Zionism is the weapon of imperialism. And the spider that has cast its web, of course, has a Magen David at the top of it. This is how pervasive anti-Semitism is in the former Soviet Union. You can only imagine what it was like to be a Jew at that time, because in 67 you have an awakening of the Jewish community of Russia. They are getting reports of the 6-Day War, and they're coming to understand that the propaganda that the Russian people are being given about Israel are lies, and that the Jewish people have revived themselves. And suddenly, during this period after 67, Jews who have been denied any sort of Jewish education are beginning to flock to synagogues. They're coming into synagogues. They are praying. And so all of this is related to the establishment of the State of Israel. The American Jewish community has changed. We are light years away from the years of Stephen S. Weiss. First of all, the Jewish community is now approaching Congress in a bipartisan way for the state of Israel. And so the American Jewish community has been becoming emboldened by the state of Israel. So there's a revival that has and a real change in America as a result of the establishment of the state of Israel. And in the Soviet Union, closer to 1967, you see this incredible revival of the Jewish community. And so you have the reality outside, but you also now have a Jewish community that is emboldened in the Soviet Union. And you see this really horrific reaction in the former Soviet Union. So if you start to look at page 194, you have these shocking propaganda pieces. Whether it's the finger of Uncle Sam with US written on the side, with a little barking dog with a helmet with a Magen David on top, it's barking, but what it's spewing out are bombs. And so here you have this little dog that is Israel. Notice the propaganda idea of Jews being compared to animals. And you have this horrible propaganda, but what gives these Jews the chance to drop bombs on innocent people is the long, bony finger of the United States, or the cartoon below. Notice that Uncle Sam and the military is driving basically a stake or a large nail into the Middle East. It's shattering it. And notice on the hammer there is a Magen David, not a Magen David, it's a dollar sign. So, all of the anti-Semitic tropes are there, or the barrel of oil that Israel that Uncle Sam is pushing, is also supporting the Israeli that's sitting on top. Now, the nice thing if you're Russia is that you don't have to look very far to find anti-Semitic material. You'll recall that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was penned in Russia, actually in Tsarist Russia. The notion that Jews control the world. Look at the cover of the Protocols of the Elder of Zion. In this particular version, it's written in France. But then look down the page, and you'll see that this notion as Jew as spider, which again harkens back to Nazi Germany, where Jews are being seen as vermin. That image is very present. And again and again. And now I'm looking on page 197. Start to see how we are moving from the Jew as victim to the Jew as aggressor, and the Jew as the victim of extermination by the Nazis, to becoming present-day Nazis. Look at how the Star of David is melding with a swastika. The imagery is profound and it's powerful. How would anyone in their right mind get to this point? It's kind of a head-spinning analogy. And from their perspective, Jews are the greatest mimics in the world. They mimic every culture. And the irony of what I'm saying is that in the price of admission in the diaspora after the French Revolution, really based upon the words of Napoleon, was that in order for you to be accepted in our society, you as a Jew would have to mimic, you would have to wear the clothing, you'd have to speak the language, you'd have to assimilate into society. And so now this is being turned against Jews as an issue of mimicry. So Jews were victims of the Nazis at one point, but now they are the greatest mimics of the Nazis. So look at the picture on page 197. You have Hitler in the shadow, and now you have this Israeli with the axe. right? And by the way, take note of the fact that whereas Hitler his hair is kind of jutting out, look more carefully at the Jew, and what you see is that it is a horn. Again, this idea of Jews mimicking Hitler is seen more and more. Page 198, you see the Israeli soldier with destruction in the background, and looking with Hitler in the middle, Hitler's face. There's an image in the middle of a Magen David, and this person smiling. Or at the bottom, you have a Nazi pig-like stormtrooper, and now you have a Jew dressed exactly the same way. And on it goes. And this is the connection. What I want you to also kind of keep in mind here is that this is that the approach of the Soviet Union is going to open the door to Arafat, who's now also rising up in the 70s. Because what it's going to say, and we're going to see this in a moment when we go back to the resolution of the United Nations, is that it's going to take the Holocaust and basically flatten the horror of it, flatten the meaning of it. And once you begin to see Jews as Nazis, once you begin to see Jews as aggressors, how can you even talk about the uniqueness of the Holocaust? And this is going to open the door to Arafat using the term genocide as the term that he will use for the Israeli treatment of Palestinians, though it has no connection. There's nothing remotely similar to the Palestinian experience and the Jews' experience in the camps, but see how this idea develops. Because if you look at the bottom of page 200, you see it clearly. The Iranians have kind of made it an obsession to deny the Holocaust. They have learned well from Arafat that if you can take that away from Jews, then the whole question about the validity of the State of Israel and its right to even be there is sort of stripped from the Jewish, from the world community. So they have contests, which are kind of basically Holocaust denial Iranian Holocaust cartoon competitions, which are really Holocaust denial. But notice this. So when Israel put up a wall, right, a security fence, a security wall to protect itself, it looks like these blocks of cement. But see the picture on it. It's Auschwitz. And so here, and here you have the crane with the Star of David. This is the winning. And you have the Dome of the Rock in the background. You have the moon in the shape of the symbol of Islam. And what you have are Jews turning the Palestinian territory into Auschwitz. So this is how powerful what the Russians were able to do in their own time, to denigrate Israel, but to also turn Israelis into Nazis. This is remarkable, and the fruit of their labor is still being felt. But one of the most powerful examples of this, and we're going to turn back to page 190. One of the most powerful examples of this is UN Resolution 3379. And while this resolution was revoked in 1991, so imagine that for 16 years this is on the books. 16 years this is on the books. Its power is being felt to this very day. we're going to look to the middle paragraph and see how the resolution is going to talk about the ills of the world and then apply them to Israel. This is, I would say, a great example of what we call today intersectionality, where we take one issue that one people are facing in an utterly different context, and then we apply them in a very heavy-handed manner to whatever other people that we want to focus on that may have other issues. So let's take a look. Taking note of the Declaration of Mexico on the equality of women and their contribution to development and peace in 1975, proclaimed by the World Conference of the International Women's Year held in Mexico City, which promulgated the principle that, quote, international cooperation and peace require the achievement of national liberation and independence, the elimination of colonialism and neocolonialism, foreign occupation. Notice we move from neocolonialism, foreign occupation, Zionism, and then apartheid. So colonialism, apartheid. It's right here. And so Israel is part of that ugly, evil club. If you look at the language of the progressive universe, we're hearing the same terminology: apartheid, colonialism. Okay, keep going. Taking note also of Resolution 77, adopted by the Assembly of Heads of State and Government Organizations of African Unity, right? And we'll skip down a little, which considered that the racist regime in occupied Palestine and the racist regime in Zimbabwe and South Africa have a common imperialist origin. Again, the intersectionality. Taking note of now the last paragraph, taking note also of the political declaration and strategy to strengthen international peace and security and to intensify solidarity and mutual assistance among non-aligned countries adopted at the Conference of Ministers for Foreign Affairs of Non-Aligned Countries held in Lima, Peru, which most severely condemned Zionism as a threat to world peace and security, and called upon all countries to oppose this racist and imperialist ideology. So here in written form is the cartoon. Jews are this spider. They are spreading their web, and it is a threat to world peace and security, and therefore the United Nations determines that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. So the connections are clear. Anti-Semitism, as anti-Semitism, is off limits. The Holocaust sort of made it off limits in that way. But the reality is that it remained an issue, but instead of focusing on the Jew qua Jew, it was Zionism became the focus of anti-Semitism. In the other readings, I'm going to skip over Yossi Klein Halevi because much of what he's going to write about, and it's very much worth reading, is going to be in the lecture that we're going to see in a moment. But what I do want to do is I want to look at Natan Sharansky for a moment with you to really appreciate his understanding of anti-Semitism. And to remind you that Sharansky is an expert on the Soviet mind. He has spent years of his life in the Gulag. He has spent years of his life in the worst Russian jails. He has spent years of his life countering the Russian anti-Semitism. So it is of interest to us that this refusnik, this great hero who then made his way to Israel and is now in a position of power and representing the Israeli government, offers his definition of anti-Semitism. Number one, and he does it in 3Ds. Well, I guess it's in 3D. The first D is the test of demonization. Demonization, when the Jewish state, I'm on page 217, when the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportions, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis, between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticisms of Israel. The second D, the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, Syria, North Korea, I'll add in, is ignored, when Israel's Magen David Adom alone among the world's ambulance services is denied admission to the International Red Cross, that is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization, when Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples in the world. This, too, is anti-Semitism. And I want to conclude this part before we watch the video by simply saying that what Sharansky says is, number one, on page 218. In the third paragraph, we found that vicious anti-Semitism, which expressly calls for massive terrorism and genocide against Jews, Zionists, and the State of Israel, is becoming more and more commonplace across the Arab Middle East. Moreover, the borders between anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Westernism have become almost completely blurred. So the Russian ability to create chaos is a powerful one. And he ends by talking about the power of linkage. And this is important, that what made for the ability of the American Jewish community to force the former Soviet Union to let the Soviet Jews go was an effort by the American Jews and the administration and the Congress to link human rights abuses to cooperation with the United States. I'll remind you of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and how it brought the former Soviet Union to the negotiating table. That type of linkage, Sharansky says, is the only way to make changes. For now, we're going to look at Yossi Klein Halevi's lecture on this issue of anti-Semitism. Not yet? Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Stand close to your mic.
In this lecture, my colleague Yossi Klein Halevi will delve more deeply into the meaning and definition of anti-Semitism, the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and whether all anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism. In doing so, he will analyze the differences between the manifestations of anti-Semitism from the far left and those from the far right, and how a commitment to Jewish peoplehood impacts on our discourse on the issue. He will then explore this issue in greater depth in an interview with Dr. Yehuda Kurtz.
Like other members of the second generation, my life was intended to be a victory over anti-Semitism. We were the miracle children who should not have been born. Our very existence proved the limited reach, even of a total war of genocide. We were given the names of murdered grandparents and told to be happy. Our happiness would be the final vindication of our parents' survival. And yet, our lives were our parents' victory, not ours. Of course, we did nothing to earn our birth. And so growing up, I was determined to earn my own victory over anti-Semitism. My childhood and youth were defined by the need to prove my worth in the struggle to protect the Jewish people. In 6th grade, together with friends whose parents were likewise survivors, I formed the Anti-Nazi Agency. We had read in our Brooklyn Jewish newspaper that neo-Nazi groups were on the rise, and that it was only a matter of time before the complacent American Jewish community was confronted with the very threat that had destroyed the complacent German Jewish community. We mimeographed leaflets that mimicked the language of our Jewish newspaper, warning of a rising Nazi tide, this hyper language, and hung them on lampposts. We collected several hundred signatories on a petition demanding that President Lyndon Johnson outlaw Nazi groups, and we mailed it to the White House. Years later, as a graduate student in journalism, I met my first real Nazis on a class assignment to the Chicago headquarters of the Nazi Party. The actual assignment was to write about any local Chicago community organization, and I chose the American Nazi Party. Here at last was my chance to confront childhood demons. Now, this was in 1977, and the mainstream media was suddenly focused on a homegrown American Nazi threat, the Nazi Party's intention to march into the Chicago suburb of Skokie, home of a substantial community of survivors. For me, it was one of those moments in life of thrilling coincidence. Here I was in Chicago with a pretext to actually go meet Nazis. I sat in their swastika-covered clubhouse and listened to their leader, a strutting little man with a long nose named Frank Collin, and he warned about the all-powerful Jews. And yet, I didn't feel fear or danger, or even, strange enough to say, loathing. Instead, I felt amused. I looked around the room and saw not stormtroopers, but a collection of losers who belonged in Mel Brooks's film, The Producers. And Frank Collin, by the way, was later exposed as half Jewish and expelled from the party and then sent to prison for child molestation. Now, the experience that day only confirmed for me the absurdity of my childhood obsession with literal Nazis. The Nazis had exceeded their own darkest fantasies, but their capacity to threaten the Jewish people was spent. What more could they possibly do to us? And so instead of fighting my father's ghosts, the real struggle against anti-Semitism in my time was the movement to save Soviet Jewry. And that became the cause to which I dedicated my teenage years. The most powerful totalitarian empire had declared war against Jewish identity. Jews were forbidden to learn anything about Judaism, and yet Soviet anti-Semitism prevented them from entirely assimilating. And when asked permission to emigrate, Jews were expelled to the margins of society or else imprisoned. The Soviet Union called itself the leader of the world's progressive forces. And so the threat to Jewish well-being in my generation came from the left, not the right. The Holocaust presented a vexing dilemma to anti-Semites: how to restore respectability to Jew hatred after Auschwitz. And it was the Soviet Union which provided the answer. The truly inspired solution devised by the Soviets was to turn the Jews into the new Nazis. The problem was no longer Jewish weakness and morality, which Hitler despised and feared as threats to humanity's capacity to survive the Darwinian war of the jungle. Now, the threat to humanity was Jewish power and Jewish racism. The Nazis' enemy, international Jewry, was replaced by the Soviets' enemy, international Zionism. In Soviet newspapers, cartoons showed the Star of David merging with the swastika, and Israeli General Moshe Dayan merging with Hitler. The Zionists had collaborated with the Nazis and now were mimicking, no, exceeding, Nazi aggression and cruelty. The Soviet gift to Jew haters was to redeem them from the stigma of racism. We don't hate Jews because we're racist. We hate Jews because they're racist. In creating the ideology of Zionism as racism, the Soviets transformed the nature of anti-Semitic threat. No longer the swastika, but the transformation of the Star of David into the swastika. The high point in the Soviet Union's war against the Jews was the 1975 UN Zionism is Racism resolution. That resolution, initiated by the Soviet bloc, labeled the movement for Jewish empowerment as inherently racist, and Israel as an apartheid regime. Those accusations, which of course are commonplace today on many campuses around the world, were born in the Soviet Union's laboratory for the new anti-Semitism. The Zionism Racism resolution clarified for me the unique nature of anti-Semitism among the various forms of racism. More than the mere hatred of the other, anti-Semitism went a considerable step further by turning the Jews into the Jew, symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as the ultimate expression of evil. And so, under pre-Holocaust Christianity, the Jew was Christ killer. Under Marxism, the Jew was capitalist. Under Nazism, race polluter. And now, in the era of universal human rights, the Jewish state became the embodiment of racism and colonialism, the most loathsome qualities of our time. Now, of course, those other more prosaic expressions of hatred for Jews persisted. The anti-Semitism of otherness. Jews were cheap or ostentatious, shabby in their poverty or vulgar in their wealth, clannish or pathetically inept in their attempts to infiltrate Gentile society. But those expressions of anti-Semitism, it seemed to me, were within the bounds of ordinary human contempt for differences. Only the anti-Semitism that turned Jews into the Jew risked becoming lethal. The purpose of the Zionism as Racism campaign was to condition the world to the necessity of destroying the Zionist state, a precursor to genocide. Zionism racism readjusted my emotional response to anti-Semitism. Mere dislike of Jews no longer especially troubled me. My focus shifted to the truly existential threat of the anti-Semitism of symbols. What kept me from feeling despair in the face of this latest incarnation of potentially lethal anti-Semitism was that this time the Jews weren't alone. The Zionism Racism resolution was almost unanimously repudiated across American society and even in Western Europe. And the campaign to free Soviet Jews was drawing significant non-Jewish support. Senator Henry Jackson mobilized Congress to link American trade credits for the Soviet regime with levels of Soviet Jewish immigration. Christian clergy and civil rights leaders have been part of the Soviet Jewry protest movement from its first days. Meanwhile, America was becoming the most welcoming diaspora that Jews had ever known. The last barriers to Jewish acceptance were falling in academia. Even restricted country clubs were opening their doors to Jews. I married Sarah, a convert to Judaism, a descendant from a Mayflower pilgrim, and from Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor who tried to bar Jews from New York, surely one of history's least successful attempts at ethnic cleansing. Thanks to Sarah, Peter Stuyvesant has Jewish progeny. The disparity in experience between my father's generation and mine was so vast that the difference between us should have been measured in centuries rather than mere decades. When Sarah and I moved to Israel in 1982, it was arguably as the freest and most privileged Jews in history, choosing to leave the most successful diaspora community for a sovereign Jewish state. In the fall of 1989, the Soviet Union began to collapse. Working as a journalist, I tracked the falling Soviet dominoes. I was in Poland when Solidarity came to power, in Prague as the Velvet Revolution triumphed. In Berlin, I saw the wall break open and felt an emotion I never thought possible, a shared sense of joy with Germans. The Iron Curtain parted, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet immigrants were on their way to Israel. Back home, I found a country that had become instantly transformed. Unemployed classical musicians played on the streets. Schoolrooms were crammed with 40 or more children. Cyrillic letters appeared on dairy products in the supermarket. This was the face of victory. For me, the most symbolic moment came in 1991, when the UN voted to repeal the Zionism-Racism Resolution, a reparation made possible by the fall of the Soviet Union. With that implicit apology to the Jewish people, the UN seemed to confirm the historic defeat of the anti-Semitism of symbols. True, in large parts of the Muslim world, pathological Jew hatred had become endemic. Hitler's Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were runaway bestsellers for decades in Arab countries. Arab state media routinely broadcast anti-Semitic messages that combined medieval themes of Jewish bloodlust with Nazi themes of Jewish world domination. And yet, there was hope for that sickness too. The Oslo peace process held the promise of ending the Palestinian conflict, one of the main sources of contemporary Muslim anti-Semitism. Now, of course, there would always be people who would hate Jews as other, but that was the mere anti-Semitism of dislike. Only the anti-Semitism of symbols truly threatened our existence. And the war against lethal anti-Semitism was on its way to being won. And now it's back. The return of obsessive Jew hatred was not supposed to happen. The Holocaust should have shamed humanity into an unconditional rejection of anti-Semitism. And with the thriving Jewish state and a self-confident American Jewry and the disappearance of the Soviet Union, history seemed to be pointing toward that historic reckoning. In retrospect, of course, it was foolish to assume that the Holocaust could end lethal Jew hatred, that unleashing the ultimate demons would somehow exhaust them. The opposite has happened. By actualizing the inconceivable, the Holocaust created new norms. If European soccer fans chant Jews to the ovens, and Iranian leaders lead masses of the faithful in chanting death to Israel, it's because the Holocaust happened. The renewal after the Holocaust of passionate anti-Semitism, as opposed to its merely casual forms, is in some sense even more shocking than the Holocaust itself. Now we know where this hatred can lead. yet the infection is spreading and generating new rationales. The resurrection of anti-Semitism after Auschwitz is arguably its greatest achievement, testimony to its extraordinary adaptability. The Soviet Union is dead, but anti-Zionism is its posthumous victory. The UN may have formally repudiated the Zionism-racism resolution, yet its impact has only grown. The UN's hatred for the Jewish state is stunning. More resolutions are passed against Israel than against all other countries combined. As UN Watch, a pro-Israel NGO, starkly put it, a nation with 0.1% of the world's population draws 78% of UN condemnations. The obsessive hatred of Israel recalls an old and familiar obsession. Only Israel is the target of an international boycott movement. Only Israel, among all the nations of our otherwise morally exemplary world, must defend the legitimacy of its existence. Only Israel. We have too easily adapted to those terrible words. Thanks in large part to social media, we face an unprecedented globalization of anti-Semitism. YouTube clips about Jewish conspiracies attract millions of viewers. And even the Nazis are back, this time not merely threatening to march through a Jewish neighborhood, but massacring worshipers in synagogues. On October 27, 2018, I was visiting a synagogue in suburban Chicago when the news came from Pittsburgh. The initial report was that a far-left gunman denouncing Trump's support for Israel had entered the Tree of Life synagogue. That report made sense to the Chicago congregants. Earlier that same week, a man shouting about Palestinian oppression had threatened to kill children playing in the synagogue's schoolyard. The shooter, of course, turned out to be a neo-Nazi, outraged by support for migrants. In the following days on a lecture tour, I participated in memorial services around Jewish America. American Jews, I realized, were telling two very different stories about Pittsburgh. One story was American, one story was Jewish, and each had a different geographical trajectory. The points along the American story were Charlottesville, Charleston, Thousand Oaks, Las Vegas, Pittsburgh. That was a story about gun control, about mindless violence, about a reckless and inciting president, generic racism. This time it was a synagogue, but it could have been a black church or a mosque. The second story American Jews told about Pittsburgh was Jewish, and its geographical trajectory included Paris, Toulouse, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Buenos Aires, Pittsburgh. This was a story about the return of violent Jew hatred around the world, and which had finally come to America. As an Israeli, I felt confused and even alienated by the American story of Pittsburgh. At one memorial service, I heard a rabbi dedicate the closing Kaddish to all victims of guns. Jews are murdered praying in a synagogue, and your takeaway is gun control. I realized that we were speaking very different languages. When Jewish leaders at these gatherings spoke about bringing the community together in mourning, they weren't speaking only of the Jewish community, but also of their non-Jewish neighbors. And this was also disorienting for me as an Israeli. Who are you, American Jews? Where does your emotional center lie? And yet, I gradually understood that both stories were true to the Pittsburgh moment. Listening to the non-Jewish speakers at the memorial services, what I heard wasn't expressions of solidarity with the Jewish community, but empathy. An attack on an American synagogue was an attack on America, on all Americans. That's what they were saying. We stand here with you, not not in solidarity, but as fellow mourners. I recently visited Pittsburgh and was struck by the still pervasive sense of grief. Jews still seemed stunned. The rabbi of the Tree of Life, Jeffrey Myers, spoke very slowly and seemed to barely move his lips as he recounted that morning to me. The synagogue remained closed. A barrier of police tape was wrapped around the building. But what struck me most were the memorial signs that still hung in store windows. Across from the Tree of Life was a handwritten poster on a fence: "We love our neighbors." In my hotel lobby hung a poster with a Star of David. Now, the normative Israeli response to Pittsburgh was, you see, American Jews thought they were home just like German Jews. But in the end, America is no different from every other exile. And yet, the outpouring of non-Jewish grief over Pittsburgh proved otherwise. The aftermath of Pittsburgh revealed that despite Pittsburgh, America is still different. I hate anti-Semitism. I hate what it does, psychologically and spiritually, to us as a people and to me as an individual. I feel infantilized by rage, sullied by intimate exposure to the most unevolved members of the human race. I feel my creativity co-opted by their fantasies, my energy distracted by the need to refute their inane accusations. Jew hatred leaks into my soul, drags me back into my fevered childhood. And yet, it's far healthier to deal with reality than to wish it away. And so, for the first time in decades, books on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust once again fill my most accessible shelves. They include books I admire, like Alon Confino's A World Without Jews, and David Nirenberg's Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, both of which make the case for the uniqueness of anti-Semitism among hatreds. And they include books I admire less, like Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which relativizes and diminishes the Holocaust. Like so many of us, I am trying to understand this moment, what it means, why it happened, how to respond. My starting point is a question that is currently dividing much of American Jewry. Which is the greater threat, the far right or the far left? The question is not trivial. How one answers can determine which non-Jews are considered appropriate allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. The answer depends in part on where the question is being asked. In America today, the most immediate and lethal danger clearly emanates from the far right. When word came of a shooter in the Chabad synagogue in Poway, we instinctively knew he was a young white male who spent too much time on Nazi websites. Still, that profile could change. The next attack, God forbid, could come from radical Islamists. Say a Hezbollah sleeper cell operated by Iran and responding to a crisis in the Middle East, similar to the terrorists who blew up Amia, the central Jewish community building in Buenos Aires in 1994. In France, despite the growing strength of the far right, the lethal threat to Jews comes primarily from radical Islamists. In Poland and Hungary, Jews fear a resurgent far right. And in Germany, they fear the far right, the far left, and Islamists. And in synagogues across America, the very viability of a venerable Jewish community is being threatened by a radicalized Labour Party. Over 40% of British Jews, according to a recent poll, say they would seriously contemplate emigrating if Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister. As British Jews note, anti-Semitism didn't legitimize anti-Zionism in England as it did in the Soviet Union, but the opposite. By promoting obsessive hatred for the Jewish state, Corbyn has emboldened the anti-Semites, who assume that Labor's culture can now tolerate attacks not only on Zionism, but on Jews and Judaism generally. So far, they haven't been proven wrong. American Jews on the left, who are calling for focusing on the far right alone, and who downplay the dangers coming from the far left, are effectively trying to remove American Jewry from the global struggle against anti-Semitism. The far right, at this moment, poses the greatest danger to American Jewish lives. But the anti-Zionist left threatens the Jewish people. We Jews are a story we tell ourselves about who we think we are. That's why the seminal ritual binding most Jews today is the Passover Seder, when we gather to once again try to understand the meaning of the story we've been carrying in one form or another for 4,000 years. In declaring war against that story, the anti-Zionists seek to undermine the spiritual foundation of our existence. The anti-Zionist left has declared war against the great post-Holocaust achievement of the Jewish people, the reclamation of power. For Israelis, that process took the form of hard military power. For American Jews, the soft power of political lobbying and coalition building and strategic wielding of philanthropy. Now, both Israeli hard power and American Jewish soft power are being targeted as illegitimate. Those committed to the well-being of the Jewish people must not minimize the nature of the threats we face from any direction. Now, I confess that after Charlottesville, I dismissed American Jewish fears of the far right, recalling my own childhood obsession with Nazis. So what if a few hundred young men marched with torches? They've always been there, they always will be there, simmering on the margins. But then came Pittsburgh, and then came Poway. And in synagogues across America, Jews now anxiously glance at the entrance and wonder who might be coming. How we deal with the complexities presented by anti-Semitism will help define Jewish life in our time. Thank you.
I'm going to first apologize for the video. You should know that we are functioning without a maintenance staff, and so we're sort of kind of jerry-rigging this whole thing. I'm happy to say that we were able to solve some of the connection problems, and so when we do the second video, it'll be much easier to hear. Look, I think this is an excellent lecture. I want to, in case you missed part of it, I'm going to review some of the salient points. I thought that Yossi's description of going to an American Nazi meeting in 1977 was interesting. That these people that he once feared were seen for who they really are, kind of misfits on the margins of society. Thought his conversation about the Soviet anti-Semitism is very important as the bridge that we talked about before, as well as his conversation about the Zionism as racism resolution. And here I'm going to quote him. Clarified for me the unique nature of anti-Semitism among the various forms of racism. More than the mere hatred of the other, anti-Semitism turned the Jews into the Jew, the symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as the ultimate expression of evil. Under pre-Holocaust Christianity, the Jew was a Christ killer. Under Marxism, the Jew was a capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew was a race polluter. In the era of universal human rights, the Jewish state becomes the embodiment of racism and colonialism. And so, unlike the common stereotypes of Jews as cheap or weak, anti-Semitism that turns the Jew into the Jew risks becoming lethal. And so, he talks about that, and he, I think, frames it very nicely. And then he goes into a conversation about how Jews across the country turned their response to wanting to have made the history of the Holocaust different, turning their attention away from the American Nazi Party and focusing on the former Soviet Union and the importance of that issue. I thought it was also important that Yossi focused on the fact that while at the same time that anti-Semitism was rising in the Arab world, you have Oslo. And so the fear of anti-Semitism was tempered by the hope that Oslo brought, but we are very far from that as well today. And he talks about the fact that anti-Semitism is back. Soviet Union is dead, but anti-Zionism is its posthumous victory. The UN's hatred for the Jewish state is stunning. More resolutions are passed against Israel than against all other countries combined. At UN Watch, a pro-Israel NGO starkly put it, a nation with 0.1% of the world's population draws 78% of UN condemnations. And then he talked also about the power of social media. What I think was most memorable in this talk was his conversation of the post-Pittsburgh shooting. The fact that he was able to kind of watch this in real time as an American who made Aliyah, so he's watching the reaction to Pittsburgh both through the eyes of an American Jew and an Israeli Jew at the same time. And the fact that the American Jewish community was divided as to whether we were talking about abject anti-Semitism or this was a gun control issue, I thought was most stark. And he was also able then to look at this through the eyes of an average Israeli and say, well, you see, American Jews thought that they were home just like German Jews. But in the end, America is no different from either. And so you have this very stark viewpoint between American Jews who are divided amongst themselves as to what's really happening here, and Israeli Jews as well. But what he also was able to see was that Americans of every stripe stood up, and this is a major difference. It's a major difference for us. That America may be different in simply the response of people around us. And the final piece that I want to underscore is that while people on the left want to point to the far right and Nazis and oftentimes President Trump and his supporters as being the real problem, I think Yossi did a very nice job in showing that you can't define anti-Semitism unless you define its context. So whether you're looking at America, where the real physical threat is coming from the far right, or in France, where the threat is coming from radical Islamists, or in Poland and Hungary, you have a resurgent far right, or in England, and he's obviously speaking before the election, and so when he's talking, the whole Corbyn issue is very hot. We know that the English voters responded, and there was a crushing defeat for Corbyn and the Labour Party, but that is coming from the progressive universe. And so we have to really think in terms of of how to approach this issue as we go forward. And he ends by talking about the Passover Seder. I think it's a very important conversation, and I'm sorry that we're not having a back and forth on this. I want to introduce the second video by turning your attention to Shaul Magid's Keep Jews Interesting. It's time to stop being defined by anti-Semitism. This was written on October 10th, or published on October 10th, 2019. This is a very important piece, and while you'll hear Yehuda Kurtzer talking about the view from the progressive left, and I think that Magid does an excellent job in presenting the view of the left in a very thoughtful and articulate way. And so if you want to read it and you want to understand where your kids are coming from, this is a really good place to start. So what does he say? He talks about, and Barry Weiss, who was supposed to be coming to Anshe Emet, is now taking it from the other side, 2 weeks in a row. So you have on the one side people attacking her because she wasn't focused enough on the right, people on the left attacking her. Now you have Shaul Magid as attacking her because he thinks that her book is insipid. It's not a strong argument in and of itself, that she's looking at anti-Semitism as the grand unifying theory of everything according to him. And if you want to understand Shaul Magid, I think you want to look on page 222 at the bottom, because he's going to talk about Salo Baron. Salo Baron was one of the great, and maybe the greatest, Jewish historian of the 20th century. And his history of the Jews, the multi-volume set, is still the most important document of its kind. But Salo Baron uses a really interesting term. If you look at the bottom, it's all my life, this is Baron talking, I've been struggling against the hitherto dominant lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Lachrymose meaning tearful, given to weeping. This kind of really, the kind of the Tisha B'Av, 365 days a year approach to Jewish life. Because I have felt, and this is Baron talking, the great Jewish historian, that an overemphasis on Jewish suffering distorted the whole picture of the Jewish historic evolution, and at the same time badly served a generation which has become impatient with the nightmare of endless persecution and massacre. So Magid is going to take this and really build off of it. It's enough already, is really what he's saying. This is not taking us to a good place. We need to kind of cast off this constant sadness and weeping and understand that it is a very different world that we're living in. And so moving on, and I'm in the middle of page 223, I articulate this position not because let's just look at this one thing. Weiss's solution, this is the third last paragraph from the bottom. Weiss's solution to anti-Semitism is what she calls leaning into Judaism, that one can fight anti-Semitism by being a better Jew or more Jewish. Anti-Semitism is a tool of kiruv, Jewish internal proselytizing. Again, I'm not sure that the answer is that's the answer. As my colleague Chaya Halberstrom from an Orthodox family said on Facebook, well, my grandparents in Europe leaned pretty heavily into Judaism and it didn't turn out so well for them. So he is kind of taking this all apart. And where does he come to? And let's go to the very bottom, the bottom of page 224. The final word goes to the American scholar of Judaica, Jacob Neusner, in his 1981 book, Stranger at Home, The Holocaust, Zionism, and American Judaism. Neusner argued that an obsession with the Holocaust or anti-Semitism, painting the Jew as a victim, the foundation of American Jews' civil religion, is essentially an act of Jewish self-hatred because it perpetuates derogatory Jewish stereotypes. This solution, and here's how Magid ends, this solution to this self-hatred then is to create a Judaism that undermines these stereotypes. Jews have been labeled self-absorbed, self-interested, and parochial. A Judaism that reaches out to the world, that takes the world seriously, that shows it cares about and is invested in contributing to matters of global concern as well as self-preservation, would counter the stereotype that Jews have come to believe about themselves. As Neusner suggests, acting from self-hatred by focusing on anti-Semitism may enable Jews to survive, but they will cease to be an interesting people. Let's try to keep Jews an interesting people. So here you see the articulation that the focus on anti-Semitism has really hijacked the Jewish community. And as we kind of begin to prepare for the second video, which we're going to show in just a minute, I want you to pay careful attention to Yehuda Kurtzer, because he's going to touch on the whole, what he's going to call the industry of anti-Semitism. He is going to level an accusation against the Israeli government regarding BDS, that BDS is really being focused on by the Israeli government as a way of stifling any conversation, any criticism of Israel. And so, is this keeping it interesting, or is it being realistic? That's the question I think American Jews need to ask themselves. Here, Yossi Klein Halevi is talking about anti-Semitism from the right and from the left. Yehuda Kurtzer is a person who is very interested in making sure that he's accepted by the left and can be part of that conversation in the left. And the question is he blinding himself, or is Yossi Klein Halevi blinding himself to the reality? Is Yossi Klein Halevi the epitome of the lachrymose Jew? And is Yehuda Kurtzer kind of the enlightened Jew who is interesting, according to Shalom Magid? Or is Yehuda Kurtzer blinding himself to the reality of anti-Semitism, the seeds, the anti-Semitism never left after the Nazism, that has kind of found a new home in anti-Israel thinking that is being perpetuated by BDS? Is he blinded by that because of his great desire to fit in and to be part of the progressive universe? That's the question of the hour. So I'm going to turn it over to what I think is a very interesting conversation between Yossi Klein Halevi and Yehuda Kurtzer.
Then came Pittsburgh, and then came Poway. And in synagogues across America, Jews now anxiously glance at the entrance and wonder who might be coming. How we deal with the complexities presented by anti-Semitism. Is really defines so much of what has become contemporary Jewish conversation.
Sure. So Yossi, in your lecture, you talked about your own upbringing and your own background as having grown up in the shadow and in the immediate memory of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and the ways that that shaped your consciousness of being someone who was inheriting the trauma of the previous generation, and in many ways looking for and identifying resurgences of that trauma in your lived experience. Speaking personally, I didn't grow up with that experience. I grew up with 4 grandparents born in America, which is actually radical in the 20th century of the Jewish people, relatively speaking. Yeah, so that was a big feature of it. I grew up as a Jew in relationship to the state of Israel, born in a period of relative security and prosperity. And as a result, I want to acknowledge that my own personal memory of trauma is different than yours. And I think that that's actually a big under-articulated story for the Jewish people, is that we think this is just about collective memory, but actually personal memory and family often shapes our own fears. I want to be clear. I acknowledge the existence of anti-Semitism. I know enough about history and I care enough about memory to know that it's there. I genuinely believe when we say in the Passover Seder, in every generation they rise up to destroy us. I don't know about the next part, which is that we don't always get saved, but I do believe that this is an enduring story. But you're right, I have tried to spend most of my career trying to get our community not to fixate on trauma and fear, not to fixate on that kind of paranoia. And part of the reason for it, I guess, is fears are never falsifiable. A fear-based approach to Jewish life can always be corroborated. You can always find some data in the existence of anti-Semitism and hate against Jews in the world to confirm that you should be scared. And it also strips us of our moral agency and responsibility. So since I know that in some ways anti-Semitism is never going to go away, since I know it exists, I'm trying to figure out, how do I live as a Jew in the world knowing that it's there and not letting it dominate us? And I wonder, Yossi, I want to flip the question back to you. Since you think about this so much, since in your lecture you talked about the ways in which it almost like the Soviets picked up the mantle of the Nazis, is there ever a moment when you say, like, enough already? I know that you're there, I know that you're out to destroy us, but I refuse to allow my paranoia about you to become dominant in my own identity.
My personal problem is that I went through that stage. I reached the point where I said, I am now free from this paranoia for certain, but even justifiable fear will not determine how I live and think as a Jew. When my first child, my daughter Moriel, was born, this was in 1985, I collected all of my Holocaust books, and I symbolically moved them from a lower shelf to a higher shelf. I didn't want her crawling around and pulling out the photo album of Auschwitz. And that was all symbolic. And yet, for me, it was really one of those crucial moments where I said, this is the dividing line. My life is not my father's life. But the irony that I'm experiencing now is that so much of the Jewish people is now where I was when I was a kid. And the fear and the obsession about anti-Semitism. Again, I think we need to make a clear distinction between unhealthy fear and a healthy willingness to deal with threat. And so my question to you is, what are your parameters for defining threat, defining credible threat, and how do we deal with it?
So part of why I sit where I sit and what I'm anxious about in the resurgence of anti-Semitism is, and I know this is a loaded phrase, I feel like there's an industry around anti-Semitism that is constantly monitoring it, fixating on it, in weird ways actually amplifying it. Deborah Lipstadt talks about this in her new book on anti-Semitism, where she says we have to figure out how to fight anti-Semitism without amplifying it. But I find that so much of the current conversation about anti-Semitism actually just gives it a bigger platform and gives it more noise. I think social media has done this in a really destructive way. I think there has to be a way that we obviously have to be vigilant in our communities around security. We have to not falsify the fears of Israelis when they talk about their existential threat. But I'm still on the other side, and I know you're pushing me towards how to name where this fear actually is and what it's about. But I just watch the way that it exhausts the totality of community discourse.
So let's look at BDS for a moment. I actually think that BDS is not a threat or a significant threat to Israel. But I do believe that it is a growing threat to the diaspora. My fear is that BDS will set back American Jewry by 2 generations, back to that point of acute American Jewish self-consciousness in the public space. The great victory of American Jewry in the last generation or two was overcoming Jewish self-consciousness. You didn't have to worry about, am I being too Jewish in public? Am I speaking with my hands? Am I saying anything inappropriate? It was in my generation that I saw the transition. And your generation grew up without that self-consciousness. BDS threatens to restore American Jews to that point where you will be asking yourself the question in certain public spaces, in progressive public spaces, is what I'm saying right now appropriate? Is this too Jewish? Is it Zionist? Is it going to mark me in some way as unacceptably other? Now, BDS is not really threatening the Israeli economy. In fact, there seems to be a direct proportion to the more BDS activity there is, the more the Israeli economy grows. But now, I'm worried about you, I'm worried about American Jewry.
So if that's the case, Yossi, why is there so much noise about BDS from the Israeli government? In other words, do you think that they think that BDS is a genuine source of existential threat to the state of Israel? Do you think that BDS is fundamentally anti-Semitic? Because I could actually understand if somebody says, if you believe that this political movement is anti-Semitic, and part of the job of Jews in the world is to combat and defeat anti-Semitism, then you feel enlisted in it. But it's actually confusing to say this isn't really a threat to me, and on that I agree with you. The data about the movement is actually quite weak. It's had very few real accomplishments. It has symbolic accomplishments. But if that's the case, why do you think our community is so invested in fighting?
Right, so look, I think that the argument can be made that the real threat of BDS to Israel is not economic, but conceptual. BDS risks raising a generation of future leaders in the West who view the very word Zionism as illegitimate. And that could have strategic consequences for Israel down the line. So in that sense, I hear the argument that's made in Israeli government circles that we can't ignore this because this is a long-term thing. It's not an immediate threat. But I see this as an immediate threat to the diaspora. Now, if we had a healthier diaspora-Israel relationship, we would be having this conversation not only between the two of us, but within the Israeli government and between the Israeli government and Jewish organizations. That conversation isn't happening.
So here's what makes me cynical about the project of fighting BDS as it's coming from the Israeli government. I actually get why a government wants to fight delegitimization movements against its country anywhere. I don't discredit the government for trying to make that effort. But what I am fearful of is that there actually is very little space in the American Jewish community on the left, especially in the progressive left, as there is increasingly in Israel, to be a principled, outspoken critic of the government's policy without being tarred as being a self-hating Jew, an anti-Semite, or being anti-Israel. I think it's actually in the interest of a right-leaning government to keep that pressure up. And therefore, maintaining the noise around BDS as an effort forces American Jews constantly to make these choices. In that respect, actually, the fight against BDS and what you described as BDS itself are both conspiring to put American Jews in this impossible situation of constantly having to perform our loyalties and our responsibilities. Partly what I would love to see is less focus on this movement. I'm with you. I don't like non-nuanced mass movements that reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a morality play. I don't like it. I don't think there's been any credible moral claim that BDS has made that their position is more moral by any standing than even that which they're fighting against. I don't want it either. I want more space. I want to be able to say, here's where I stand in support of the decision of the Israeli government, and here's where I oppose it. That's the tool, that's the stuff of relationship. But as it's currently constructed, all we have is this option of either what I find to be an immoral and ineffective political movement to delegitimize Israel, and a totally ineffective and maybe even counterproductive effort to try to tamp down that movement.
Okay, but let's dig a little bit deeper. Is your assessment of BDS, does it go beyond dislike to something more acute? Do you sense that BDS might be constricting public spaces for American Jews?
I think that is absolutely the interest. I think that's the interest of almost any type of protest movement like that, is to try to get people to have to perform their loyalties one way or another, and BDS is not alone in that respect. But I think I want to parse a Talmudic distinction in BDS. There is what BDS represents as a political, in theory, non-violent movement that seeks to protest the actions and maybe even the existence of the State of Israel. And then there are a whole set of individuals and sometimes organizations associated with the movement. On its face, a movement like BDS is not inherently anti-Semitic and not inherently problematic. Americans have a long and storied and wonderful history of boycott movements, including connected to the civil rights movement, that are not only not immoral, but they are actually tools of civil disobedience. Are there individuals and organizations of bad faith connected to that movement? Absolutely. And I think there are anti-Semites located in that movement. But we gotta be, this is critically, Yossi, and I feel this very strongly as an American Jew. The response to BDS can't be so, as a movement, can't be so out of proportion that we wind up doing counterproductive things to the very things that make us thrive as American Jews. When American Jews get on board with shutting down free speech laws in order to prevent BDS coming in place, you're cutting off your whatever to spite or whatever. You're actually undermining what has made America a thriving place for Jews, which is free speech in the public square.
Okay, let's take it a step back. Before we get to the conversation about how to fight this, what the most effective or ineffective way to fight this is, let's look at the phenomenon of BDS itself. Doesn't it trouble you that the only international movement advocating the boycott of a country is aimed at the Jewish state?
Yes.
Say more?
Of course it does. That's why I don't support the movement. That's why I oppose it. I also agree with you that there are ways in which the rise of this movement, relative to all sorts of other international crises, it doesn't smell right. Here's where I sit as a Zionist in relationship to the story. We have this weird thing as part of Jewish Peoplehood and as part of Zionism, where we want to be exceptional and we want to be normal at the same time. Here, Israel has this ambivalent relationship to the West. It wants to be of the West, right, in some ways, but it doesn't want to be held accountable of the West in other ways. I think the occupation presents a unique problem in the West. Mm-hmm. It also has to do in part with the eyes of the world are focused on this story as a morality play. Mm-hmm. This has been the case since the dawn of time. This is the cradle of civilization. It happens here. So I think part of the fixation on the story has to do with a whiff of anti-Semitism, the obsession with this, and part of this has to do with the fact that human civilization and the relationship to the West are complicated, and we even have our own ambivalent relationship to whether we want to be different than the family of nations or belong to the family of nations.
I think that's a really important point that many Israelis often overlook, but there's an equally important point that many American Jews overlook, which is that this is not just a story of occupation, it's also a story of Israel finding itself in the anomalous situation, the unique situation of being the only country in the world that lives under a permanent death threat issued by many of its neighbors. We are the only country in the world for whom existence, the right to exist, is an issue. Now, think of how that plays on the Jewish psyche, that 70 years after the Holocaust, we are the only people on the planet that needs to defend our legitimacy, our right to exist. For me, as an Israeli, it drives me mad. And so when I look for a real conversation with American Jews, I'm also looking for an emotional partner here. I'm with you on the occupation, and I'm with you at exactly that point that we can't have it both ways. We can't be part of the club of the West, of democratic nations, and be the only democratic country that's a long-term occupier. But I need you as a partner in the conversation that says, well, we also can't tolerate a situation where the only country in the world whose legitimacy is under question is the Jewish state.
So this is something I've learned from you, really, over the years, which is the ways in which Israelis look to world Jewry not to falsify your fears. I get that. I really have learned from it. And I have changed my approach, oftentimes, to things that are in the news about what happened in Israel, how's the story playing out, to first try to listen to the voices of how Israelis are responding before I come to my own conclusions and before I act as a referee. This decision was right, this decision was disproportionate. I still sometimes may not agree with my Israeli friends' diagnosis of their reality, and oftentimes I identify with minority voices in Israel who say, you know, even in something like the Iran deal, there were minority voices in Israel who were actually in support of the deal.
Very
Minority, but you have taught me, and I've learned from it, to listen to the fears of the Jewish people and to not falsify them. I guess by the same logic, what you're asking for is empathy and to some degree a generosity of spirit in responding to not only our threats but to each other. Part of the reason I want to make sure that we don't take major groups of people and collapse them into being haters of the Jewish people is in some ways part of the same logic. I don't want to be in the business of walking around the world in this unbelievable condition that the Jewish people are in, deciding that anyone who gives off a whiff of some politics we don't like is anti-Zionist and therefore anti-Semitic, and I'm watching the way that it's happening. I think what you're trying to ask me and pushing towards, and I'm trying to formulate, is I'm interested in a conversation not of is anti-Zionism or is BDS anti-Semitic. I'm interested in a conversation of when is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic, when does BDS cross over, and I want the reciprocality that I want from Israelis is to listen to us saying, we're trying to hold a line as American Jews in our support for Israel, our criticism of Israel. We're also trying to hold relationships in coalitions with other people who have more ambivalent relationships to Israel. But when we are forced to paint with too thick of a brush in broad strokes of anyone out there who it sounds bad, that we have to treat them as being our enemies, it puts us, I think, all of us in an untenable position.
Okay, but there's a distinction between ambivalence toward Israel and outright denial of Israel's legitimacy. And for me, that's where the line runs. And my question to American Jews is, are we partners in that distinction?
You know, a few months ago, I had a conversation with a bunch of Israeli friends, Olim, about the gap between us, between American Jews and Israel. They were all living over the Green Line, living in a settlement, and I went out there to talk to them because I'm really concerned. In general, I believe that we should find more ways to be talking to people who we don't have automatic agreement with. So I went and talked to them and I went to listen. And the question I asked them was, I talked to them about American Jews distancing from Israel, what that's about, and I said, does this concern you and does it obligate you? And they all said it concerned them, but they couldn't come up with any language of obligation for themselves. Mm-hmm. What they were able to say is, here are all the ways that I feel let down by American Jews. Mm-hmm. And when I asked them, well, what if I told you that 75% of American Jews, not all, that 75% of American Jews believe that the current President of the United States constitutes an existential threat to what we experience as America, and therefore who we see ourselves as Jews as in America, they went ballistic. Because they said, no, we like the current president because he's good for Israel.
Right.
And I said, hey guys, you can't have it both ways. If what you're telling me is, stop falsifying my fears and stand with me, then why doesn't it actually go in the other direction? And I don't think that the sum total of the question of what's good for Jewish peoplehood can be reduced to how does the state of Israel and its citizens define who are our friends and who are our enemies.
But it has to work both ways. Now, I agree with you, and I feel obligated by American Jewish fears toward President Trump. I take those fears seriously. I think that Trump is the single greatest threat to the post-World War II liberal order, which is precisely the condition that allowed American Jewry to become the most successful diaspora in Jewish history, maybe the most successful minority anywhere. And that's thanks to the liberal order which this president is threatening. So while I don't believe that this president is necessarily an anti-Semite, I also don't care if he's personally an anti-Semite or not. He is indirectly threatening the well-being, the fundamental well-being of American Jewry.
We have to figure out how to listen to each other and our fears, but that means not painting each other in these big brushstrokes that makes it impossible for us to live these alliances. And here, and I think this is a key point of the whole anti-Semitism conversation, especially for American Jews on the political left. American Jews on the political left, many of them, believe that anti-Semitism is a real thing. They believe it's a real thing in America, and I think they correctly understand that anti-Semitism in America is less bad, if you want to say such a thing, as structural racism against African Americans. Much less bad for American Jews.
Cold comfort.
Right? Now, what happens is, if the dominant voice from the pro-Israel community is constantly policing who are our alliances, who are our partners, who are our coalitions, around whether they are anti-Semites or not, good for the Jews or not, it strips away our capacity to actually be involved in a serious way in the battle for racial justice. And it actually reinforces anti-Semitism, because it says to our partners, the Jews only care about their own fate.
Right. I think that this really touches on a basic conflict between how Israelis view the resurgence of anti-Semitism and how American Jews view it, which is, do you view it in an American context primarily, or in a global Jewish context primarily? And depending which way you tell that story will really help determine how you choose your allies, and whether you really see this threat as a resurgence of an existential threat, or as something that is more than a nuisance. It has become lethal in some ways, but is still, as you put it, far less of a threat to the Jewish minority in America than the threats that other minorities have to contend with. And there's no way to resolve this, because we sit geographically and psychologically in totally different contexts.
Look, I do push my friends on the progressive side of things that if their definition of anti-Semitism is entirely restricted to white nationalism, then it's going to make what happens in France inexplicable and incoherent.
Yeah, they're pulling themselves out of a global Jewish context.
And I tell them, any definition you come up of anti-Semitism has to incorporate expressions of anti-Semitism in the world that are inconvenient, right? You're going to have to tolerate, anti-Semitism includes, a Palestinian axe attack in a synagogue in Hartman. That's part of this story. It includes the shooting in a Paris synagogue, etc. And that is actually hard for American progressives, because they have, in many ways, aligned anti-Semitism as part of a family of hatreds under white nationalism that makes you have to contort it to make sense of why it exists in the Muslim world. I'm with you on that. What I would say, though, and it was very jarring in reading your lecture and hearing it, when you talked about what makes you scared of, what makes you more scared. American Jews are more scared of white nationalist anti-Semitism in America because they're the same, actually for the same reasons in reverse that you talked about why you're scared of anti-Semitism on the left, the denial of our narrative, the attack on Jewish peoplehood. I think there are reasons that American Jews should be fearful primarily of white nationalism because it's actually a threat to our bodies. And in that respect, that's why I find the competition, left is worse, right is worse, so unbelievably silly, because when you've partisanized anti-Semitism, you've diminished the collective capacity of the Jewish people to actually fight it.
So the good news is that both threats are serious.
The good news, bad news is both threats are serious. And you asked me at the beginning, Yossi, what makes me scared? This is what makes me scared. What makes me scared is that the conditions of Jewish thriving in America and Israel are actually forcing us to choose between our fears. And a strong Jewish people would recognize that its strengths could actually be leveraged compatibly to recognize that both of these things should make us nervous. That actually anti-Semites on the right and anti-Semites on the left are allies, but that we collectively have enormous capacity, potential, friends in the world, allies in the world, to be able to combat this more effectively. So I would say ultimately I'm a little bit less scared of the anti-Semites themselves, and I'm more scared that the way that we are approaching anti-Semitism is diminishing our collective capacity to defeat it.
Yehuda, truly a joy. There's no one else that I'd rather argue with more than with you.
Likewise, thank you. Yes.
I thought that was an excellent conversation and really powerful, and I hope that you will take the time to watch it again. Actually, I've actually watched this more than once. And each time I watch it, I'm really struck. And I'm going to, in our remaining 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about that. But before I do, I want to just say this again. Next week, we're going to be using Zoom video. And all of the instructions will be sent to you. And as we approach next week, I'm also going to assume that you will have watched the videos in advance. That way we can have a conversation together about the materials, and we can review the book, and then we can also have a conversation back and forth, unlike today where I'm sort of just talking at you. So going back to the lecture. The first thing that struck me was how people's life experiences also affect their worldview. Yossi Klein Halevi spoke and wrote really, really powerfully about growing up in a home where your parents are survivors. How the meekness of his mother, how the mistrust of his father weighed on him. The father's mistrust of the non-Jewish world, and how he approached a church, what he thought of Christians. All of that, played into his understanding of himself in this world, how as a young child he would fantasize about hunting Nazis down in a way to avenge the past. When Yehuda Kurtzer is talking, he's talking about the fact that his grandparents on both sides were born in America. It's kind of a remarkable thing. And how that affects his worldview. He feels very comfortable in his past, whereas when Yossi Klein Halevi is talking about his past, the fact that he married a woman who chose Jewish life and who could trace her family back to Peter Stuyvesant was a great thing, because now we're having our revenge on Peter Stuyvesant. He didn't want to let Jews in. Now Peter Stuyvesant has Jewish great grandchildren. This is a very particular way of looking at the world, but it comes from that viewpoint. I'm quite sure that Yehuda Kurtzer wouldn't see it that way. So that's one thing I wanted to underscore. I also wanted to come back to Yehuda Kurtzer's, statement about the industry around anti-Semitism, and that ultimately continues to amplify anti-Semitism in the world, and that when we pay attention to it, it makes it more of a problem than it really is. It was clear that Yossi Klein Halevi didn't agree with that point of view. But I think it's an interesting conversation to have. Does the fact that whenever Louis Farrakhan wants to say anything about the Jewish community, and he likes to do that, he gets press immediately. He's suddenly like, he's the New York Times picks it up, CNN picks it up. And are we over-amplifying it as a result? And that kind of that ties into Kurtzer's point that he wishes that the American Jewish community had greater confidence, because then it would be able to manage itself better. So it's an interesting question about where are we as a Jewish community? Can we really see both sides and manage both sides? This is also part of Kurtzer's understanding of the racial distinctions. I thought it was a very, very powerful and interesting point that he made when he talked about the fact that racism in this country, structural racism, as he spoke about it, is a much greater threat to people of color than anti-Semitism is to Jews. And the fact that if we focus too much on the issue of anti-Semitism, if I say that your relationship with someone that I see as an anti-Semite makes it impossible for me to talk to you, then we are not only opting out of the conversation about racism in America and denying our own Jewish predilections on the issue of the stranger, which would thrust us into that conversation, but the issues of anti-Semitism prevent that. But also, and here Kurtzer also says, it also increases the possibility of anti-Semitism, because Jews could easily be seen as people who only focus on themselves. All they care about is Israel and themselves. They don't really care about us. And so I spoke about this a few weeks ago, that the fact that Louis Farrakhan is seen by the Jews as as a anti-Semite through and through, and yet in the African American community, especially amongst younger African Americans, is seen in heroic terms as a man who's willing to stand up to white America, who's to say it like it is, and that strips us from our ability to be in conversation with some potential partners in the African American community, and makes us suspect when we want to be part of those progressive conversations, is something to consider. And I think that, whether I agree or disagree, I think that Kurtzer did a really nice job in focusing on that. I also thought it was interesting that Yossi Klein Halevi continued to bring the Israeli perspective into it. And I want to talk for a minute about this notion of falsifying your fears. An interesting phrase. When American Jews talk about criticize Israelis for building a wall, and say, or when American Jews talk about the Israeli responses as being disproportional to the Palestinian response, right? Israel has an air force. Palestinians living in Gaza have helium balloons, right? Israelis have M16s, and Palestinians have rocks. So when you begin to kind of look at this disproportionality, right, and American Jews begin to criticize Israeli responses, that for Israelis feels like we are falsifying their fears. We're saying that your fears are overblown, as if we have any concept of what it means to serve in the IDF, as if we have any concept of what it means to be surrounded by enemies on every side. So I think that that's a very interesting issue that he raises. By the same token, and Kurtzer made this point in a very interesting way when he talked about going to see New Olim, who are living on the other side of the Green Line. That when he talked about the fact that they feel like American Jewry is failing them, and the fact that American Jews don't appreciate the pro-Israel stance of the Trump administration, was of interest. But at the same time, when he asked them to see the world through the American Jewry's eyes, that for many American Jews, the vast majority of American Jews, President Trump represents a threat to those institutions that make for a liberal democracy in America, that open the doors to Jewish participation in the American dream, and to participate in the American forms of government, that those ideas are coming under threat, is a threat to American Jews. And when Israelis say, I don't know what you're so worried about, that falsifies our fears, and that makes it very difficult for us to have a conversation. The one criticism that I would level, and I've mentioned this before, but I think it's really striking, is that both Yossi Klein Halevi and Yehuda Kurtzer represent either kind of a center-right Israeli thinking or left-wing American Jewish thinking. But there's no one on this panel that is representing the right of Israel, or the far right of Israel. There's no one there who's making an articulate or thoughtful argument as to what their position is. It's as if everybody's talking about what their position is without having someone at the table. Other than that, I think that there's a lot to talk about and a lot to think about. And I'm going to close with what I thought was probably the most important aspect of this, and that's the conversation about BDS. Is BDS a threat? And Yossi Klein Halevi's notion that BDS is not a threat, is more a threat to the diaspora community than it is to the Israeli community, was a really interesting question and a really interesting point that I thought he made, and something that really deserves further conversation. And if you're interested, maybe we can start with that as we go into next week's class session. I want to thank you for taking the time this morning to be with us. I want to thank you for your patience with our attempts at technology. Most of all, I want to thank Dan and Mary Joan for really helping and being part of this. If you saw what the room looked like, it's kind of put together in a kind of a really interesting way. I want to thank Amy for her endless work on this, and I want to wish everybody a good day, and I hope everyone will stay safe, keep their social distance, and follow all the CDC recommendations, and I hope that all of us will continue to stay healthy, and that this plague that we are faced with will soon lift. Have a wonderful day.